We move now to questions for oral answer. Question number 1, David Bennett.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Finance. What recent announcements has the government made to accelerate the supply of new housing where it is needed the most?
The Honourable Bill English.
On Sunday, the Prime Minister announced a new $1 billion housing infrastructure fund to help bring forward the new roads and water infrastructure needed for new housing where financing is a constraint. It's the next step in the government's comprehensive housing plan. The contestable fund will be open to applications in high-growth areas. It will be available only for substantial new infrastructure that supports new housing, not to replace existing infrastructure. To access the fund, local councils must outline how many new houses will be built, where they will be built and when they will be available.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, David Bennett.
Thank you. What current constraints to infrastructure provision will the fund help to overcome?
The Honourable
Mr. Speaker,
Bill English.
As part of its comprehensive plan, the government recently proposed a national policy statement on urban development capacity, which will require councils to ensure land supply for housing and business keeps ahead of growth. Feedback on the national policy statement has been positive, but councils have told us that the infrastructure and its financing is one of the key constraints where more supply is required. Some councils have strict debt limits, which means they lack headroom to invest in infrastructure. The fund will provide more infrastructure sooner by aligning the cost to councils with the timing of revenue from development contributions and rates of newly built houses.
Supplementary question, Denis O'Rourke.
Does the Minister agree with home builder Mike Greer on the new $1 billion housing infrastructure loan fund? Quote, "It will all be used for Auckland. There won't be a dollar leaves Auckland for sure," unquote. And if not, will he give an assurance that other centres will get some?
Either of those two supplementary questions, the Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the high growth areas covered by the fund are Christchurch, Queenstown, Tauranga, Hamilton and Auckland. But of course we would expect more houses will be built in Auckland where the highest demand is occurring.
Supplementary question, David Seymour.
What proportion or percentage of funds awarded to councils through this fund will need to be repaid in the long run?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, in the long run, the councils will repay whatever assistance the government offers.
Order. Order. Supplementary question, David Bennett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What options is the government considering for how the fund could be implemented?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the intent of the policy is to provide upfront cash flow to councils in a way that doesn't accrue as debt on their balance sheet. One option for achieving this is the Crown Fibre Holdings model, where the government finances and owns the infrastructure up front. There would be then an arrangement where the infrastructure is purchased off the government as houses are built, in the same way that Crown Fibre Holdings repays the government when new subscribers sign up to ultra-fast broadband. Another option is to use the financial assistance rate for councils in the National Land Transport Fund, a tool that has been used before. These options mean the government would face some uptake risk if houses are not built, which is why the proposals from the councils need to be very clear about when and where new houses will be built.
Come on, Phil, ask a question.
Supplementary question, Denis O'Rourke.
Does the Minister agree with Mike Greer on what the government funding is really needed for when he says, quote, "Government has to pay for the land and to provide the housing, otherwise it's too hard to do," unquote? And if not, why not?
Again, there are two supplementary questions there. The Minister, the Honourable Bill English, can address
Well, Mr.
one.
Speaker, there are many developers who would like the government to pay for the land so they don't have to take any of that kind of development risk. But we're not going to do that. We're going to help councils with the timing of the revenue they need for core trunk infrastructure, which will open up new supply of new houses.
Order. Supplementary question, David Bennett.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. How is the fund expected to impact on the government's finances?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, depending on the number and timing of applications, the fund will require the government to temporarily borrow up to, but not necessarily actually, $1 billion, increasing net debt until the infrastructure is sold. Because the infrastructure is expected to be sold or financed in the future when councils can benefit from the greater revenue flows, it's not expected to impact on the budget capital allowance. Any impact on the surplus will depend on the nature of the infrastructure project itself.
Supplementary question, Denis O'Rourke.
What difference will a $1 billion loan fund really make when the new Waterview to Mangere sewer pipe alone will cost $950 million?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, it'll make the difference the councils say it should make. Councils already have in their long-term plans significant investment in infrastructure. We've discussed in detail what the constraints are for further spending on top of the growth they've already anticipated, which in this case is over 10% in the case of each of these cities. And this is the constraint that the council tells us can be dealt with.
Supplementary question, David Bennett.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. What other constraints are there to getting more houses built, aside from infrastructure?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, the reason the government has a comprehensive plan on housing is because there are a considerable number of constraints. For instance, the speed of the planning process, which is run by the councils, the consenting requirements, which consents are issued by the councils, the need to consult local communities, which is a job to carry out by the councils. And now that the building industry is running so fast, it's becoming apparent that there are constraints in the building industry as to the availability of labour and building materials.
Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Minister, if any of that's true, why on earth hasn't he told the chairperson of the Finance and Expenditure Select Committee the facts, rather than have him getting up here asking these innocent, stupid questions?
Order. 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 I have a point of order from the Honourable Gerry Brownlee.
Mr Speaker, how can you take that question as being a reasonable question to the House? When the member asked if any of that is true, why hasn't he conveyed the facts? Now, Mr Speaker, the two don't mix. It's one or the other.
Order. Order. I was going to allow the question to stand to give the Minister a fairly wide chance to answer it, but in this case there isn't a responsibility from the Minister for a Member of Parliament who happens to chair a select committee. Question number 2, Andrew Liddell.